It all started with a letter. Not just any letter, a thick, official-looking envelope with an HOA seal stamped right at the top. The kind of envelope that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. At first, I thought it was just another one of Karen's petty complaints. Maybe another warning about my trash bins being half an inch too far from the curb. Or a fine because my lawn dared to have a single blade of grass taller than the others. But when I tore it open and read the words printed inside, I had to blink. Twice. I was being evicted. My own home. The house I owned. At first I laughed. It had to be a mistake. No way could the HOA kick me out of my own property. But then, as I read the letter again, my laughter died. The wording was carefully chosen. Phrases like, "Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings," jumped out at me. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a mistake. This was war. And at the center of it all, Karen. I should have seen it coming. From the moment I moved into the neighborhood, she had been on a mission, not just to enforce rules, but to control. She was the type of person who got a taste of authority and decided she was royalty. It started small. A friendly warning about my grass being a little too long, a passive-aggressive note on my car about where I parked in my own driveway, an email about my front door color being slightly outside the approved shade range. At first, I tried to play along. I trimmed the lawn, moved the trash cans, even changed my light bulbs to a lower wattage just to avoid conflict. But no matter how much I complied, it was never enough. One morning, I woke up to a fresh violation notice taped directly to my front door. Unauthorized decorations was the listed infraction. Confused, I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing had changed. My porch looked the same as it had since the day I moved in. Then I noticed it. The tiny welcome mat I had placed at my doorstep. A plain, simple doormat with the words, "Home Sweet Home," written across it. That was it. That was the problem. Apparently, Karen had decided it wasn't in line with the neighborhood aesthetic. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. This was personal. Karen didn't just enforce the HOA guidelines, she created them. And whenever she found a new way to tighten her grip on the neighborhood, she took it. I had heard stories from other residents, people who had been fined for having the wrong mailbox, for parking in their own driveway, for hanging up a small wind chime. And now, she had set her sights on me. I was the newcomer, the outsider, the one who hadn't been molded into submission yet, and Karen was determined to break me. Then came the final straw, the eviction notice. The moment I saw it, my heart pounded. Eviction. Was that even possible? Then I read the last line again. Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. That was a serious threat. I had read about HOAs pulling shady moves, racking up fines, claiming unpaid dues, then using that as a legal loophole to force homeowners into foreclosure sales. It was rare, but it had happened before. And now Karen was trying it on me. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because Karen, in all her self-righteous arrogance, had made a crucial mistake. She had spent so much time trying to control the neighborhood, trying to force me out, that she never stopped to check one simple detail. She didn't know that I owned her house. Yeah, you heard that right. Through a series of investment purchases I had made years ago, long before I ever moved into this neighborhood, I had bought several rental properties. I never paid much attention to the individual tenants. I had a property management company handle the leases and rent collection. But now, standing in my living room, eviction notice in hand, I pulled up my records. My heart pounded as I searched for her address. And there it was, clear as day. Karen wasn't just my neighbor, she was my tenant. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, letting the realization sink in. Karen had sent me an eviction notice for my own house. Meanwhile, she had been living in a house that I legally owned this entire time. A slow grin spread across my face. She had no idea. This was no longer just about getting revenge. It was about setting things right, about making sure Karen finally got a taste of the power she had been throwing around for years. I pulled up her lease agreement and started reading through it carefully. The more I read, the better it got. She had violated multiple clauses. Harassment of other residents? Check. Unauthorized modifications to the property? Check. Interfering with legal property ownership? Big check. I sat back and exhaled. This was airtight. Karen might have thought she was the queen of the HOA, but in reality, she was nothing more than a renter who had broken the terms of her lease. And just like she had given me 30 days to leave, I could give her the same. But this was too good to waste on a simple email. This needed to be done in person. This needed to be delivered. The next afternoon, I took a slow walk toward Karen's house, my house. She was outside, clipboard in hand, scolding another poor neighbor about their mailbox being not HOA compliant. She turned when she saw me, her lips curling into that familiar smirk. "I assume you got the notice," she said, her voice dripping with smugness. "It's nothing personal, but the HOA has made a decision. You don't fit the community standards, and we can't have that." I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. "Oh, I got the notice." I reached into my folder and pulled out a crisp stack of papers. "And I have a response." I handed it to her. She took it with a raised eyebrow, unfolding it slowly. Then I watched. I watched as her expression shifted from confident to confused, then from confused to horrified. Her lips parted slightly, her hands tightening on the pages as she read each word. This is a joke, right?" she stammered. I shook my head, grinning. "Oh no, Karen. This is very, very real." She looked up at me, her face pale. You can't do this." "Oh, but I can." I leaned in slightly. "The house you're renting? It belongs to me." Her hands trembled. "You sent me an eviction notice for a property I own." I let that sink in for a moment before delivering the final blow. "And now, Karen, you have 30 days to leave." Silence. For the first time since I moved in, Karen had nothing to say. Karen stood there, gripping the eviction notice as if squeezing it hard enough would somehow make the words change. Her face was frozen in a mixture of disbelief and barely contained rage. Her lips parted, then closed, then parted again. She looked like a fish, gasping for air. You can't be serious," she finally managed to say. I crossed my arms, keeping my expression calm, even though, inside, I was savoring every second of this. "Oh, I'm very serious, Karen. You sent me an eviction notice for a property I own, completely unaware that your house is also mine. And since you've been violating your lease agreement left and right, well, let's just say you're no longer welcome in my community." The irony wasn't lost on me. She had spent years dictating who did and didn't belong in this neighborhood. She had been the final boss of the HOA, enforcing rules with an iron fist, making other homeowners miserable. And now, she was the one who was about to be removed. She clutched the papers tighter, her knuckles turning white. "There has to be some mistake," she hissed. You can't own my house. I pay rent. I've been here for years." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the property records. A few taps later, I turned the screen toward her. "See this? That's the deed. My name. Right there at the top. This isn't a mistake, Karen." Her eyes flicked across the screen. I could see the moment the truth hit her. It was like watching a tower crumble from the inside. This This isn't fair, she stammered. Fair? I let out a short laugh. You were trying to evict me from my own home, over some made-up HOA rules that don't even apply to private property, and now you want to talk about fair? Karen was shaking now, her breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. Her carefully crafted mask of control was slipping. I have rights, she snapped, grasping for some kind of argument, some kind of lifeline. You do, I agreed, which is why I'm giving you the same courtesy you gave me. 30 days to vacate. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I turned to leave, but then I paused and looked over my shoulder. Oh, and Karen, don't think about pulling any HOA strings to delay this, because HOA rules, they don't override landlord laws. And trust me, I know my rights too. Then I walked away, leaving her standing there shaking, still clutching her own eviction notice. This was just the beginning. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line immediately told me everything I needed to know. Unauthorized eviction proceedings, violation of HOA bylaws. I let out a dry chuckle before even opening it. Karen was scrambling, and this was her next desperate move. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you have engaged in unauthorized eviction proceedings against a resident of our community. The HOA has strict policies regarding retaliatory actions and unlawful displacement of members. Any further attempts to remove a resident without due process will result in immediate fines and legal action. Immediate fines. Legal action. Oh, Karen was really trying it now. I tapped out a reply, making sure every word was dripping with barely contained amusement. Dear HOA Compliance Team, thank you for your concern regarding unlawful evictions. However, Karen is not a resident as you describe. She is my tenant. As the legal owner of the property she occupies, I have the full right to terminate her lease for cause, which I have done in accordance with state and federal housing laws. I would also like to remind you that any attempt by the HOA to interfere with lawful landlord-tenant matters could be considered harassment. Should this continue, I will have no choice but to pursue legal action against the HOA. Best regards, your favorite landlord. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, waiting for the next move. And sure enough, later that afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I knew before I even opened it. 2 uniformed officers stood there, professional but slightly weary, as if they already knew this was going to be a waste of time. Sir, we need to speak with you regarding a complaint, one of them said. I sighed, shaking my head. Let me guess. Karen? They exchanged a glance. She claims you are unlawfully evicting her and using intimidation tactics. I stepped aside. Come on in, officers. I have plenty to show you. I sat them down and handed over everything. Karen's lease agreement, the violation notices, the HOA emails, the termination notice, properly drafted with all the legal requirements. One of the officers skimmed the paperwork, then let out a long breath. He turned to his partner. This is completely legal, he muttered. The other officer nodded before looking back at me. Sorry to bother you, sir. This happens more often than you'd think. People don't understand that HOA rules don't override landlord-tenant laws. I smirked. Yeah, I'm starting to get that impression. The officers left soon after, but not before knocking on Karen's door. I didn't hear everything, but I did catch the tail end of it. Ma'am, this is a civil matter, not a police issue. Don't call us again unless there's a real emergency. The door slammed shut. I smiled to myself. First crack in Karen's armor? Check. But she wasn't done yet. Karen still had 30 days to vacate, and I knew she wouldn't go quietly. She had already tried to weaponize the HOA. That failed. She had tried to get the cops involved. That failed. So what was next? Pure, desperate, petty sabotage. Over the next few weeks, I noticed little things happening around my house. My mailbox mysteriously went missing one morning. HOA violation notice for not having an approved mailbox arrived the same day. My trash cans were somehow knocked over almost every other night, and then I'd get an HOA warning about improper trash disposal. One evening, I came home to find my driveway partially blocked by a construction materials sign. No actual construction, just the sign. A fresh HOA notice arrived the next morning. Improper use of driveway space. Karen was grasping for anything to make my life miserable before she had to leave. But it didn't matter, because no matter how many ridiculous HOA fines she tried to throw my way, no matter how many petty pranks she pulled, the reality was this. She was still on borrowed time, and eviction day was getting closer. And the best part? She knew it. I could see it in her face every time she saw me. The way her jaw clenched, the way she averted her gaze, her usual smugness completely gone. She wasn't the queen of the HOA anymore. She was a tenant with no power. And soon, she was going to be gone. The knock at my door came earlier than expected. I had been waiting for it, anticipating it. But I thought Karen would have at least lasted another week before making her next desperate move. When I swung the door open, 2 uniformed officers stood there, their expressions unreadable but professional. "Sir, we need to speak with you regarding a complaint," the taller one said. I leaned against the doorframe, already exhaling in exhaustion. "Let me guess, Karen?" The officers exchanged a brief glance. "She claims you're attempting an illegal eviction and that you've been harassing her," the second officer explained, flipping open a notepad. "We just need to ask a few questions." I fought the urge to laugh. Karen was really that desperate. She had already failed with the HOA, failed with the email threats, and now she was bringing in law enforcement. I gestured toward my living room. "Come on in, officers. Let's clear this up." Once they were seated, I pulled out the folder I had specifically prepared for this exact moment. I laid it out on the coffee table and opened it to the first page. "Here's Karen's lease agreement," I began, pointing to the bolded section with my name at the top. "I am the legal owner of her property. I am not some random neighbor targeting her. I am her landlord." The officers scanned the document, their eyes moving over the text carefully. "Now here is the notice of lease termination," I continued, flipping to the next page. "Given to her in accordance with state law, giving her 30 days to vacate." I turned the page again. "And this? This is a list of lease violations she's committed. Harassment of other residents, unauthorized modifications to the property, interference with my legal rights as a landlord, all valid reasons to terminate her tenancy." I flipped to the final page and slid it toward them. "And here is my response to the HOA when they tried to get involved, just in case Karen tried to claim they had any authority over my decision." One officer sighed, rubbing his temple. The other officer nodded slowly, tapping his pen against the table. "This is all in order," he admitted. "There's nothing illegal here." I smiled. "Glad we could clear that up." The taller officer closed his notepad and leaned forward. "Unfortunately, sir, we still have to follow up with Karen, but from what we're seeing, there's no unlawful eviction taking place here." "Oh, don't worry," I said, waving my hand dismissively. "Take all the time you need. I'd love to hear what she has to say." They stood up and made their way toward the door. As soon as it closed behind them, I walked over to the window and peeked through the blinds. Karen's door swung open before they even had the chance to knock. She was ready, arms crossed, lips pursed, already mid-rant before they could say a word. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught the tone, indignant, angry, insistent. The officers listened for a few minutes, nodding occasionally. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, One of them held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Then came the words I had desperately wanted to hear. "Ma'am, this is a civil issue, not a police matter. Don't call us again unless there's a real emergency." Karen's face went red. The officers didn't wait for a response. They turned and walked back to their patrol car, completely uninterested in hearing whatever final, desperate argument she had. Karen stood frozen in her doorway, staring after them as if willing them to come back. But they didn't. I watched as her hands clenched into fists. Then, slowly, her head turned toward my house. Our eyes met through the window, and for the first time since I'd moved in, she didn't have a single smug expression left to give. She had lost. At least she had almost lost, because Karen wasn't the type to go down without making one last scene. I didn't think she would actually comply with the eviction notice. That would have required common sense. Instead, over the next few days, Karen went into full-scale meltdown mode. The first thing I noticed was the mailbox stunt. I woke up one morning, stepped outside, and found that my mailbox was gone, completely vanished. The post was still there, but the actual box, nowhere in sight. I wasn't even surprised when I checked my email and found a fresh HOA violation notice waiting for me. "Dear homeowner, we have observed that your property is now missing a mailbox, which is in violation of community standards. Failure to replace it within 7 days may result in fines." Karen was still trying. Then came the trash bin sabotage. For 3 nights in a row, I put my garbage out as usual, only to wake up and find the bins knocked over. Every time it looked suspiciously deliberate, with the lids popped open and the contents neatly spilled onto the driveway. And of course, a new HOA email followed. "Dear homeowner, your recent non-compliance with proper trash disposal procedures has been noted. Kindly ensure that all waste bins are secured properly to avoid penalties." Karen was scrambling. Desperation seeped into her actions. She had lost control, and she knew it. But instead of cutting her losses and packing her bags, she was doubling down. I had to wonder, did she actually think this would work? Did she believe the HOA still had any power over me? That these absurd little stunts would somehow convince me to let her stay? Or was this just her way of throwing a tantrum before she had to face reality? Either way, it didn't matter. Because as far as I was concerned, she was done. And eviction day was getting very close. The best part, she knew it. I could see it every time she saw me. The panic, the rage, the way she gritted her teeth when she saw me coming and avoided eye contact. Karen had been the queen of this neighborhood, the ruler of the HOA, the self-appointed enforcer of all things proper. And now she was nothing more than a renter, a tenant with no power, no leverage, and no future in this community. Because in just a few days, she was going to be gone, whether she liked it or not. The morning of eviction day arrived with a crisp silence that felt almost unnatural. For the first time in weeks, I woke up to a peaceful neighborhood. No passive-aggressive HOA notices, no sabotaged trash bins, no Karen looming like a vulture, watching my every move. But I knew better than to believe she had given up quietly, because Karen wasn't the type to pack up and go without one last act of defiance. I brewed my coffee, took a slow sip, and glanced at the clock. The sheriff's department was scheduled to arrive at 9 a.m. sharp, and I intended to be standing outside with the best seat in the house when it happened. At exactly 8:55 a.m., I walked to the sidewalk in front of her house. No, my house. The property I legally owned, the one she had spent years acting like she ruled over. The house she was about to be forced out of. The street was quiet. The neighbors had their curtains half drawn, pretending not to watch, but definitely watching. Everyone had been waiting for this moment. And then, right on cue, the sheriff's department car rolled down the street and pulled into the driveway. Two uniformed officers stepped out, a clipboard in hand. Karen's front door was still closed. No movement, no sound. One of the officers knocked firmly. No answer. Knocked again. Still nothing. I folded my arms, exhaling through my nose. Of course she wasn't going to make this easy. The officer sighed, turned to me and asked, "You're the property owner?" I nodded. "Yep," and I gave her way more than enough notice to leave. He nodded, then turned back to the door. "Ma'am, this is a court-ordered eviction. If you do not open this door, we will have no choice but to enter the premises and remove you." Silence. Then finally footsteps. The door creaked open a fraction of an inch, and there she was. Karen. She looked rough, dark circles under her eyes, wrinkled clothes, hair a mess. But despite her disheveled appearance, she was still clinging to that last shred of defiance, her lips curled in a scowl. "This is illegal," she spat. "You have no right." The officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, this is not a debate. This is a court order. You have 15 minutes to vacate." Karen's breathing was quick and shallow. She wasn't just angry, she was panicking. Her eyes darted between me, the officers, and the house. I could practically see her brain working, scrambling for some last-minute scheme, some final loophole that would get her out of this. But there was nothing left. She had exhausted every excuse, every trick, every desperate play. This was the end of the road. Still, she wasn't going to leave with dignity. Because instead of nodding, instead of going inside to grab her things, Karen did what Karen did best. She snapped. "You'll regret this," she hissed at me, stepping forward, her finger jabbing toward my chest. "This whole neighborhood will go to hell without me keeping it in order." The officer moved between us, holding up a hand. "Ma'am, step back." Karen ignored him. She spun around, storming inside the house, her footsteps heavy and frantic. Then, through the open door, I heard it. A crash. Another. Then shouting. I sighed. I knew she wasn't going to go quietly. The officers exchanged a glance before stepping inside. "Ma'am, step away from the property. Destroying the house will only result in further legal action." I stood just outside the doorway, watching as Karen yanked open drawers, knocking over furniture, throwing picture frames against the walls. Pure, unfiltered, rage. One of the officers turned back to me. "Do you want to press charges for property damage?" Oh, how tempting that was. But I just shook my head. Not unless she does something major. I just want her gone. Karen turned on me, her eyes wild. "You think you've won?" she sneered. "You think you can just push me out like I'm nothing?" "I don't think I've won," I said evenly. "I know I have." She let out a frustrated scream, kicking over a chair. 10 minutes, the officer warned her, "or we remove you by force." For a second, I thought she was going to push it further, force them to drag her out kicking and screaming. But then something in her just collapsed. The fight drained out of her. She inhaled sharply, then exhaled in a shudder. Without another word, she grabbed the single suitcase sitting by the door, the only thing she had actually packed, and stormed past me, shoving her shoulder into mine as she went. She stomped down the steps, her face burning red, her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. She threw open her car door, tossed the suitcase in, and slid into the driver's seat. Then she turned to glare at me one last time. "You'll regret this," she spat. I raised an eyebrow. "No, Karen, you will." And with that she peeled out of the driveway, tires screeching as she sped off down the street. And just like that, she was gone. The officers locked up the house, changed the locks, and handed me the keys. The nightmare was over. I stood there for a moment, staring at the now empty house, breathing in the peaceful silence. No more Karen, no more HOA dictatorship, no more nonsense, just my neighborhood, finally free of her reign of terror. And then, just when I thought this entire saga was behind me, I got an email. I opened my phone, and my jaw actually dropped when I read the subject line. HOA board seat vacancy. Invitation to apply. Oh, this was rich. I clicked it open, shaking my head as I read. Dear homeowner, due to recent vacancies, there is now an open seat on the HOA board. As a valued member of the community, we would like to extend an invitation for you to apply. I actually laughed out loud. Karen had been booted from her house, stripped of her self-imposed throne, and now they were practically begging me to take her place. It was almost poetic. Almost. But I had zero interest in becoming the new HOA overlord. I didn't need to control this neighborhood. I had already won. So instead of replying, instead of even entertaining the thought, I closed the email, set my phone down, and enjoyed the beautiful Karen-free silence. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood finally felt like home.